I'm afraid I'm going to play the part of the dinosaur here today for two main reasons. One is that I'm not a neuroscientist, and I'm going to speak about a Persian poet who lived in the 13th century and of celebrated philosopher who lived in the 5th century BC, which is, of course, a long time ago. The second reason why I will here play the part of the dinosaur is that I will not give you any visual support. You will not have a PowerPoint. But I have justifications for that. About Rumi, the mystical Persian poet of the 13th century, and about Plato or Socrates, I don't know which one is the guiding philosopher. But anyway, I think both can be, today, in our everyday lives, guiding masters, guides to a better living. And this that I'm telling you is based on personal experience, because they have played the part of living guides in my own life, and they have shown me the way, in many ways, through the journey of life, and they have shown me the way to become a better human being in the end, which is all that is about here today. And why you will not have any PowerPoint? It's because of what Rumi says about words and about poetry. He says that if you want to reach the truth, your ears must become eyes. So what I invite you to is to transmute your ears into eyes, because what is important in poetry and the truth that poetry has to give us is in what they call the imaginal world, that is the insight, the visions that you may have inside your own brains. I don't know which color that would be in the brain imaging, but anyway, it's very important that through words, and this was also Plato's method through his dialogues, Socrates' method. It's through words that you have to build your own images. So I'm not going to give you the images. You're going to be led to those images through what Rumi and Plato have to tell us. The physical manifestations of the experience of love and ecstasy are generally very close in different traditions. Even without going as far as considering mystical love, which was sometimes stigmatized as being a kind of hysteria by modern psychologists, love in its most earthly level even has been often considered and as presented as a sickness or a madness, a passion that directly affects the body. This passion has even been considered sometimes as something induced by a lack of balance in the humoral system. Which of the egg or the hen is first has been a subject of discussion since the antique times, and we have seen today that this discussion is going on. What is sure is that philosophers and doctors alike have from times immemorial reckoned that there was a close interaction between body and mind, or to use the classical vocabulary, between body and soul, in any emotional experience in general and the experience of love in particular. This does not mean that they refused to acknowledge the transcendent and ineffable aspect of it. In the same way as the sacred pervaded the whole world in its most material aspects, transcendence never meant disconnection from material realities. On the contrary, the whole material reality of the universe was a visible manifestation of the invisible to the classical philosophers. So the universe was a living sign of the constant interaction between heaven and earth, body and soul, God and his creatures. Strangely enough, it is the radical dichotomy between body and soul in the modern ages, of which Descartes was, I'm afraid, highly responsible. So it's this dichotomy that led to consider the bodily phenomenons as something completely separate from the activity of the soul, and vice versa. The intricate relationship between soul, or mind, or spirit, or whatever you may call it, and body, so the soul and body, had to wait modern psychology and more recently neurosciences to be again taken seriously and studied through the unprecedented technological means we have at our disposal, or at least neuroscientists have at their disposal, because I don't have those technological means. To just show this from a philological point of view, I would like to insist on a word that Rumi, I'm going to come back to Rumi and who he was, but just first, a word that Rumi and all the Persian poets use. That word is the word John. And it's a very interesting word, because in itself it shows how much body and soul are interconnected in classical Persian thought. John in Persian means what animates the body in its most physical way. You know, John is what you lose when you die, the living force that you lose when you die. And it's also what makes you feel that you're alive. It's also the soul. It's also a word that specifically means the immaterial soul. But it also means what is dear. And when you, even in everyday life, you can say to someone, you say, John, it means my darling, my dear, my soul, and my living force. All these are, of course, interconnected. And actually, Rumi says in a verse, body and soul are joined to form one whole. He uses the word John for that. Tan ze jano, John ze tan mastur nis, which gives you also maybe an idea of the music. Body and soul so are very closely connected. But, he adds, we don't have the eyes to see this connection. So it's interesting. He says that material realities and invisible reality of the invisible reality of the soul are connected, but we cannot see them because we don't have the right eyes or the right spectacles. At the time of Rumi, there was no such thing as neurosciences and cerebral imaging. And yet, as a mystic and a spiritual master, he had a particularly vivid insight into human psychology. And in that, he was the heir to a whole tradition that's called the tradition of Sufi psychology. And all those mystical masters, which were the forerunners of Islamic spirituality, had developed a whole system of psychology that proved how deep they had gone into their knowledge of human psychology. And as a poet, Rumi was particularly powerful in creating images that would recount his knowledge of psychology, that would explain what he meant by what happened in human psychology. In poetry, actually, when poetry is inspired, the metaphors stand for a representation of truth, not only a way of putting things, not only a way of telling you or making you understand something, but an actual reflection of abstract realities. What I mean is that in Sufi thought, which was highly inspired by Platonic thought or Neoplatonic thought, there is this idea that there is a realm that is called the imaginal realm, which is here and now present, but we don't see it. And yet it's more real than the material world that we think is so real. And after all, maybe it's not so real as we think it is. And of course, you can see the connection between this idea and the Platonic idea of the realm of ideas, which are definitely more real than the material projections of those same ideas or archetypes. And poetry has to do with that. The images of poetry are the images of that realm. They are imaginal words which are to show us something of a reality we cannot see, with what Persians call the eyes of the head as opposed to the eyes of the secret soul. So true reality is not the reality of matter, but the reality of this imaginal world, the world of ideas. By opening up the eyes of the soul, the experience of love, as told in poetry, allows us to get rid of the illusion of reality and gain access to another reality above the material world. So the visual faculty is very important. But by visual faculty, again, we don't mean what you can see with the eyes of your head. And this visual, the visual presence of images is very important. Of course, it's visible, it's evident that it's important even in religions, because you see that in every religion we have representations of paradise, for example. Why that? The representations of paradise are supposed to open the eyes of the soul and motivate the soul to do what is right to do to someday arrive in that world that is so powerfully represented in religious traditions. In poetry, so, words make us see, in the same way as mythological accounts, such as those told by Socrates, transform abstract ideas into tangible images. Before telling you the story I'm going to comment upon, and that is a story recounted by Rumi in his didactic work, just a few words on Rumi himself. Rumi lived in the 13th century, in a time of turmoil, by the way. The Mongols were, of course, violently killing and destroying the world all over. In many ways, the world of Rumi was very much like ours in its violence. But the essential experience of his life was that one day he was a scholar, a revered master, he had his pupils, etc. And one day, around the age of 40, he met a dervish, or he met a person who suddenly introduced him to the experience of mystical love. And this experience changed him utterly and turned him from a scholar into a poet. This is, roughly speaking, the most important facts to know about Rumi. And it's because he had this experience of love, although he was a spiritual master before, that he started his poetry and he started telling people about something else than what he was telling to them before. That is, that leading a moral life has nothing to do with what you must do or you mustn't do. Living a moral life has to do with the experience of love, insofar as the experience of love allows you to set aside your illusions, to come closer to the truth. And it's because you become closer to the truth that naturally you become a moral being, because you become a real human being. It is not something that's imposed from society or from outside. Very often, Rumi says that the religion of love is beyond good and evil. This doesn't mean that you can do anything you want. It means that once you have behold the truth and the beauty of the beloved, then naturally you are motivated, you are propelled to become a real human being. And that is what morality is about in Rumi's thought. And I would say that we can draw a close parallel between this and what Plato or Socrates or Diotima, I don't know who is speaking in the symposium, but a set of people are telling what somebody else has told, etc. Anyway, what is displayed in the symposium is exactly the same idea, is that the experience of love is an experience of how you desire goodness, how you desire truth, and how these desires are in a way awakened in the soul by the contemplation of beauty. So we see the interrelation between beauty, wisdom, morality, and truth are there in Plato already, and they have been thought upon by Sufi writers and poets, and Rumi in particular. Now, let's come to the story of Rumi. It's the story of the king who fell in love with a slave girl. It's a long story, so I'm going just to make a long story short. It just starts this way. Now here's a tale for you to contemplate. It tells the truth about our present state. It is Javid Mojaddedi's translation. There was a king most glorious and refined, with spiritual and temporal power combined. Once he was riding on his favorite steed, out hunting with his friends, whom he would lead. When he beheld a slave girl near the fray, his soul became her servant straight away. So you see, in the beginning of the story, you have a king who has all the powers. He's king in every sense, spiritual and temporal. But what happens with love at first sight is that immediately everything is reversed. From king, he becomes a servant. That is one of the alchemic powers of love. It is that it changes, it turns you to something else. Even if you're a proud king, it makes of you a humble servant of a slave girl. So he buys the slave girl, but as soon as he has bought her, she becomes sick. And of course, the king sets out to find a healer that would heal his beloved. The king brought healers from all distant lands. Our lives are both now in your expert hands. My life is over till she's well again, for she's my medicine, distinguished man. Light of my life, Nur, light of my life. Whatever makes her well, more treasure wins than he could ever sell. But, as you may guess, none of the healers is able to heal the slave girl. And why not? Because, Rumi tells us, they look at her body only. They look at the symptoms. Very strangely enough, I think there is a debate now going on in medical studies that, if you just look at the symptom, can you really make a good diagnosis? If you treat only a symptom and not make the right diagnosis as to the source of that illness, is it good medicine you're practicing? Rumi's answer clearly is no. Because whatever they do have the contrary effect, and they cannot heal the slave girl. So, desperate, the king is hopeless, and he turns to God. He realizes that, after all, the best thing is to turn to God in such a situation. He goes into the mosque, he prays, and God tells him that he will send him a real healer that would be the healer of the soul. And that is exactly what happens. As he has dreamt it, someone comes. I have no time to go through the whole description of that person who comes. But what is important is that Rumi tells us that he is a master, he is the healer of the soul, and he is both visible and invisible. So he is a very strange creature. And I would like here to say that, of course, this healer of the soul is the representation of his own master, the person who had introduced him to love, whose name was Shams. And in many ways, Shams looks like Socrates, because Shams wouldn't exist without the poetry of Rumi, as Socrates wouldn't exist without the dialogues of Plato. Shams is someone who tells the truth even at the price of harming people. So did Socrates. And Shams has been loved beyond imagination by Rumi, as Socrates has been loved beyond imagination by Plato and, strangely enough, by Alcibiades, who at the end of the symposium makes that beautiful encomium of Socrates telling that he thought what he loved was the body of Socrates, but he realized after a while, again, I don't have time to read the whole passage, but it's a very beautiful passage, and I really invite you to read it or reread it again. But he says, no, and I realized that it's not the body of Socrates I loved, but his soul. Why? Because what Socrates tells me, it is something about truth. It is something about my own soul. And he opens something in my soul that makes me feel I can be a better human being. That's why I love Socrates. And that is exactly why Rumi loved Shams, and that is why the king will fall in love with the healer who comes. And he will tell him, the one I love is not that maid, but you. He suddenly realizes that from earthly love he has been driven to spiritual love. One thing led to another, as they do. So we have here the idea that even very, very earthly loves are good experiences of love because they introduce us to the feeling. And then, little by little, life itself and our progress in the path of perfection, perfection of our soul, will lead us to understand that earthly loves are only the manifestation of a greater love, which is invisible, actually. So the healer comes and he tries to, of course, the king brings him to the slave girl so that he can heal her. And there we have a long passage that I'm not going to read, but that is, to my knowledge, the first literary representation of a session of psychoanalysis. Because the healer goes to the slave girl, he takes her pulse and looks at her complexion and asks her to tell about her childhood and her town and what she did and the people she knew, etc. And as she speaks, he just keeps to her pulse to see when the pulse will become quicker and when her complexion will change. It has to do with the blood flood we were talking about this morning, I suppose. And he discovers that actually, you know, there's a long, long passage where he says, well, and then he asked her about the city of Samarkand, and then suddenly her pulse becomes quicker, and he realizes that she's in love with a goldsmith who lives in the city of Samarkand. So they send for the goldsmith because he says to the king, she has to be united to him, because otherwise she will not be healed. So they send for the goldsmith, they bring him to the court, they marry them, and so the slave girl is healed because she achieves love. But in the meantime, the healer gives a poison to the goldsmith, so that little by little he loses his beauty, he loses his hair, his teeth, he becomes yellows, and she stops loving him altogether. So she's healed, and she's also healed from earthly love. Of course, it's not, Rumi is not saying that you have to kill goldsmiths when your daughter falls in love with them. It's, of course, a symbol of earthly love. And the idea that earthly love is necessarily transient, but you have to go through that experience if you want to understand really inside your soul how transient earthly beauty is. And it's through this transformation that you can be healed from your attachment to the world. So there are, of course, many levels of love in this story, as there are many categories and levels of love in the symposium, which is a very intricate work of art, I would say, not only a piece of philosophy, because through a text that is poetry, even though it's not known as being so, I think the symposium is sheer poetry. In the same way as Rumi uses poetry, Plato uses poetry to show us all the different nuances and levels of love, and to show us that love is ultimately, of course, the pursuit of happiness, but most of all, the possibility for human beings to achieve something that otherwise they wouldn't achieve. Why? What is that something which we can achieve through love? It is renouncing the self or the ego. And that is why Rumi says that just before telling this story, he says in a passage where he explains what love represents to him, if I can find it, that's what he says. Unchain yourself, my son, escape its hold. How long will you remain a slave of gold? You've tried to fit inside a jug the sea. It only has a day's capacity. A greedy eye is never satisfied. Shells only when content grow pearls inside. While men whose clothes are ripped to shreds by love are cleans of greed, like this to rise above. Be joyful, love. Our sweetest bliss is you, physician for all kinds of ailment too. The cure for our conceit and stubborn pride, like Plato here with Galen side by side. Through love the earthly form soars heavenward, the mountain dances nimbly like a bird. So, love gives the possibility to renounce everything. Why? Because in the process of love, you want to contemplate the beauty of your beloved. And the beauty of the beloved, both in Plato and in Rumi's work or thought, cannot be seen anywhere else than in the heart. It's a reflection in the heart. That is why you have to know yourself to look at yourself. But not only to know yourself and to look at yourself, but also to polish the mirror of the heart. Polishing the mirror of the heart is a very classical image that has been very often used. But it shows us very powerfully how contemplation of beauty, experience of love, and moral issues are connected. Because to polish the mirror of the heart, you have to renounce your ego. And that is all that there is to morality, to renounce to yourself in the name of something higher. And of course, by doing all those moral actions that may take many different forms, you polish your heart. You renounce yourself. You renounce the veil. You push aside the veil of your ego, and you can contemplate, in the end, the beauty of the beloved reflected in your own heart. And of course, it's love that helps you to do this, but it's also to ultimate love that you arrive when you do this. So, you know, it's a kind of virtuous circle to enter into this experience of love. A close and parallel reading of the Symposium, the Republic, the Phaedrus, and the works of Rumi show us that for Socrates, as for Rumi, love, justice, beauty, and goodness are closely connected and are part of the philosophical or the spiritual process. Here may be just a few words about the relationship between spirituality and philosophy. Again, it's a very modern dichotomy we make between the two. In the times of Socrates, as Pierre Hadot has shown brilliantly in many of his books, philosophy has had to do with spirituality, and philosophical exercises were basically spiritual exercises. So when I say in the context of what Socrates did, there is a close relationship, if not complete identity, between philosophical and the philosophical and the spiritual process. Anyway, wisdom, truth, love, beauty are intertwined to guide the soul up to her perfection. Although the emphasis on love or spiritual love is much stronger in Rumi's approach to the meaning and goal of human life, he also develops a whole ethical pattern weaved around what he called his religion of love. And as I said, the first step to do this is to distinguish between material and spiritual love, although carnal or human love can ultimately lead to spiritual and immortal love. Again, in the Symposium, Plato remarks that, for example, love, it is thanks to love that many people become courageous. It's because you love somebody that you become courageous and you develop a certain number of virtues. But love is also, as I said, the experience of depossession, of renouncing to the ego, renouncing to the self for the sake of the other, at the price of your own happiness and comfort. But it is to gain a purer happiness and a higher comfort in the end. To quote from Rumi's lyric work, this definition of love: love is but blessing and fortune, nothing but guidance and dilated heart. The law of permissible and impermissible pertains from now until the day of death. The knowledge of lovers is eternal. And elsewhere he says, the fearful ascetic charges on foot. Lovers fly lighter than lightning in air. showing that, again, morality has nothing to do with with leading an ascetic life. It has nothing to do with what you do or what you don't do, but why you do things and why you don't do them. You decide not to do them. It really the source of morality is intention. And what makes the right intention is how close you are to the truth. In another poem, the rhyme of which is "What I Long For," Rumi explains what he longs for. He longs for many beautiful things, among other things, beholding the beauty of the beloved. But in just one verse, he says that yesterday the sage, and he's of course alluding to Diogenes, the sage was looking around the city with a lamp, saying, "I'm tired of wolves and demons. The human being is what I long for." They told him, "We have been searching that for a long time. It cannot be found." And he answered, "What cannot be found is what I long for." I would say that because love is the experience of the ineffable, because love is exactly what cannot be found, in a way, it's exactly what we should, all of us, long for. And that's the lesson of the whole work of Rumi, which amounts to 140,000 verses. He's only speaking of that. What I long for is the human being, not the human being around me, but the human being in me. Maybe it sounds unattainable in the same way as true love sounds attainable. But actually, it is a horizon. And the whole meaning of human life is to never forget to look at this horizon and continue to walk on in the hope to someday maybe see the horizon reflected in the mirror of the heart. I would say that in many ways, Rumi had a scientific approach to love as a phenomenon. His whole work is an exploration of all the manifestations, categories, complications, causes, and effects of love. The word she'r in Persian, which means poetry, comes from a root that means understanding, cognition. So poetry is a cognitive process for the mystic poet. And I think narration is also a cognitive process for Socrates, who tells so many tales to make his ideas clear. Rumi had a radical personal experience of it, and he was trying to make his audience understand not only that the moving force of the whole universe is the power of love, but also that the only force that leads to the perfection of humanity was nothing but love. Love, he says, is the alchemy of alchemy. It transmutes everything into something higher. Thank you very much.